The first time a Dubek warrior saw a human sit at the back of the transport, he assumed it was out of fear. That assumption was the last mistake he ever made. The transport was standard for diplomatic summits, rows of sturdy seats bolted to the floor, strong enough to hold even the largest species. The V-towering reptilian warlords were seated up front. Their hulking frames shifting impatiently behind them sat the Gari, whose thick-shelled cuirasses scraped against the interior with every movement. A few Zola seni and tall with too many joints claimed, the midsection chattering in their sharp clicking speech. The humans, as always were, in the very back slouched, as if they didn't have a care in the universe. Garel Aver, veteran of 100 wars, was annoyed. No, he was insulted. Humanity had only been part of the galactic concord for a few decades, and yet they acted as if they knew something. The older species didn't always in the back, always watching, always so frustratingly casual, it were of weakness. He turned his head slightly, his crimson eyes narrowing. "Is it cowardice that keeps you there?" Human Sergeant Nolan, the human in question, exhaled through his nose. "Just have it," he said, offering no further explanation. Garval curled his lip. "I have seen prey act as you do, keeping to the edges, avoiding the strong." He flexed his claws against his seat's metal armrest. "But you are supposed to be warriors, are you not?" Nolan smirked. "You don't seem to know much about us." The Zala near the center hissed. Amusement the Drari, who had little patience for words, merely watched Garv's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, the transport jolted to a stop. The doors at the front hissed open, revealing the dark expanse of the docking bay. The summit was to take place on neutral ground, an orbital station positioned at the center of known space, meant for peacekeeping. But something was wrong. The lights flickered, a thick silence stretched across the bay. Then came the sound of metal twisting and screaming under immense pressure. Garval rose, as did the other Ver, their instincts sharpened by years of war and ambush. He growled. The first explosion hit before anyone could react. The shockwave sent bodies flying, seats ripped from their bolts. Garval was thrown forward, slamming into the opposite wall. He barely had time to register the pain before a second explosion rocked the transport. The Verek scrambled to recover, but the assault was relentless. A third explosion tore open the side of the vehicle, exposing them to the docking bay, where dozens of attackers swarmed in. They weren't just pirates. They moved with coordination, their weapons cutting through even Drari armor. Plasma of fire filled the air, and the Vir, though built for war, were caught off guard. Garval roared, swiping at the nearest. As silent, his claws met flesh, tearing through the attacker's suit. But there were too many. He turned, expecting to see the humans cowering in the back, but what he saw instead made his breath catch. Nolan wasn't there anymore, neither were his men. Then the lights failed entirely in the darkness. There was movement, a shadow quick and fluid, a sound like a blade cutting through air, a strangled cry, another, then silence. A dim emergency glow bathed the bay in red. The attackers were gone. No, there they were, sprawled across the floor, motionless. Their bodies were still, their weapons untouched. Gal's heart pounded. His warriors stood stunned, scanning the battlefield, and then he saw them at the edge of the bay, near the back, just beyond the carnage. The humans, Nolan and his men, were standing there untouched, as if the chaos had never reached them. Their weapons were still holstered. Their uniforms had not a scratch. They looked at the remaining warriors with an expression Garval had never seen before, something far worse than fear. He turned, looking at the V with an expression that sent a chill down Garval's spine. "We sat in the back." It wasn't an answer, but at the same time it was. The humans had moved only when the chaos reached its peak, and by then it had already been over. No warning, no grand show of force, just a cold, efficient eraser of every single threat in the room. The silence in the docking bay stretched, but there was no time to dwell from the corridor beyond the wreckage. Alarms blared and heavy boots pounded against the metal floor. More hostiles were inbound. The Verak Drari and Zeeth warriors gathered their weapons, bracing for another attack. This time, though they weren't so certain of their standing, they had spent their lives believing they were the strongest the galaxy had to offer. Yet just minutes ago the humans had revealed something none of them could deny, an understanding of battle that none of them could grasp. The entrance to the docking bay burst open, and a new wave of Salants stormed in. These weren't simple pirates or mercenaries. Their weapons were heavier, their movements sharper. Their tactics honed. A squad of 5 human soldiers stepped forward. Nolan didn't even give an order. His men just moved seamlessly without hesitation. They advanced without taking cover, without fear, as if they already knew the fight was decided before it began. The first shots rang out, and the humans reacted faster than any species Garval had ever seen one of them. Sid stepped an incoming blast with the smallest shift of his stance, returning fire in a single unhurried motion. Another moved through the chaos like a phantom, closing the distance before his target even realized what was happening. The other warriors barely had time to react. The VCK fought like beast claws and plasma blades carving through the enemy. The Drari relied on brute force, their thick armor absorbing blows that would have killed lesser beings. The Soth were fast, striking at vulnerable points with surgical precision, but none of them were like the humans. The fight was over in minutes when the last enemy fell. Garval turned his gaze to Nolan once more. The human was already walking toward the far end of the docking bay, barely acknowledging the carnage. "You knew, Garv." B growled, striding after him. "You knew they were coming." Nolan shrugged. "Of course we knew." The V bared his fangs. "Then why did you wait?" Nolan finally stopped giving Garval a long look. "Because we don't fight fair. We don't fight for honor or dominance or any of that nonsense your kind cares about." His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something Garval couldn't define. "We fight to win." There was nothing more to say. The group pressed forward, leaving the docking bay behind. More enemies waited, but the outcome had already been decided. The humans walked at the back of the formation just as they had in the transport. And for the first time Garval understood why the corridors of the orbital station stretched before them, dimly lit and filled with the echoes of distant combat. The remaining warriors of the VCK Drari and Zolo advanced cautiously, their weapons ready but their ents shaken. The humans followed at the rear as always. Silent, watchful Garval had fought countless battles, but now with each step he found himself more focused on the men behind him than the enemy ahead. They had revealed something unsettling, something he had never considered possible, and that unknown gnawed him more than any enemy ever had. They pressed forward, dispatching smaller resistance groups with brutal efficiency. The humans never took the lead. They never rushed. They let the others engage first, stepping in only when the fight became too difficult. Every time they did, the battle ended instantly as they neared the station's control center. The enemy prepared their final stand. Heavy gun imp placements lined the walls. Automatic turrets locked onto their position, and a squad of elite enforcers took defensive positions. This would be the hardest fight yet. Garvil flexed his claws, preparing to charge. The Drari braced their shields. The Zola slid lied into flanking positions. The humans, they did nothing. Nolan simply exhaled and looked at his men. Time to clean up. They moved faster than anything Garval had ever witnessed, not with the reckless abandon of berserkers or the desperation of cornered prey, but with precision. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, a language of war. Only they seemed to understand. The enemy barely had time to react. The first turret exploded before it could even fire. The second jammed after a single burst. One of Nolan's men disappeared into the shadows, and a moment later, half the defenders crumpled their throats. silently slit the Vac warriors charged forward, only to realize the humans had already cut through the bulk of the enemy force by the time Garval reached the last remaining defenders. There was no one left to fight. The battle had ended before it even began. The control center doors hissed open inside. A high-ranking enemy officer stood, weapon-drawn, face contorted in desperation. "Stop!" the officer shouted. "You don't understand." Nolan raised a single hand. The officer hesitated too late. Nolan said a single shot rang out. The officer collapsed his weapon, clattering uselessly to the floor. Silence filled the room. The battle was over. The mission was complete. Garval turned to Nolan. His throat tight with words he never thought he'd say. You fight differently." Nolan met his gaze. "We fight to win." The Brank warrior clenched his jaw. He had spent his life believing his people were the pinnacle of strength, the masters of combat. And yet here they stood alive, not because of their might, but because the humans had chosen to let them survive. As they made their way back to the transport, Garval fell into step beside Nolan. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Why do you always sit in the back?" Nolan smirked, because that's where the survivors are for the first time in his life. Garval had no response. The war was over, but the consequences of what had been witnessed would ripple across the galaxy for generations to come. The battle at the orbital station had not only secured a diplomatic victory, but had shattered the perception of humanity in the eyes of the most powerful species in known space. The Drari and the Zoloth had always believed themselves the apex warriors of their time. They had measured strength in brute force, honor in direct combat, and victory in the number of bodies. Left behind, the humans had rewritten those definitions in a single night, as the survivors returned to their respective fleets. The uneasy silence among the warriors said, more than words ever could. The Vi, once boisterous and eager to recount their deeds, now spoke in hushed tones. The Drari, who had prided themselves on their impenetrable defenses, had seen enemies crumble before the humans even needed to fire a shot. The solo masters of strategy and precision had watched an even greater calculation unfold before them, one they could not yet understand. Garval sat alone in his quarters, replaying the battle in his mind. Every tactic, every movement, every decision the humans had made. They had been patient, calculating, always waiting for the right moment. It was not the strength of their weapons, nor the efficiency of their strikes that unsettled him. It was the way they had known exactly how the fight would play out before it had even begun. A message pinged on his personal console. It was a summons from the Biera High Council. Of course they would want answers. He did not have them. The humans had returned to their fleet without celebration, without a single boast or claim of dominance. They had simply completed their mission and left that more than anything disturbed him. Warriors fought for glory. Conquerors fought for power. But the humans, they fought for something else entirely. The transport to the High Council chamber was silent. Garval walked past rows of elder VCI, their expressions unreadable. They had all seen the reports. They had all heard the whispers. Humanity had changed the battlefield forever. The High Chancellor, an ancient warrior, scarred from centuries of conflict, watched him approach. "We have read your report," he said. "We have spoken with the Drari and Zith leadership. Tell us, Garral, do you believe humanity is a threat?" The question hung in the air. Gal's claws flexed at his sides. A part of him wanted to say yes. A part of him wanted to warn them, to tell them that the humans were unlike anything they had ever faced. But he had seen something else that night, something far more dangerous than their efficiency in battle. "They are not a threat," he said finally. "They are a warning." The council chamber fell into a heavy silence. The Chancellor's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Garval took a breath. "The humans fight as if they have already seen the end of the war. They do not seek conquest, nor do they revel in combat. They fight with purpose, with finality. It is not about power or pride for them, it is survival. The Chancellor leaned forward. And what does that mean for us? Garval met his gaze. It means that if we ever force them into a war, they will end it before we realize it has begun. The chamber remained silent. Long after he had spoken across the galaxy, similar discussions were taking place. The Drari war councils debated their fortifications, wondering if their defenses would mean anything against the species that needed no fortresses to win. The Zola strategists attempted to predict human battle patterns, only to find that their calculations led them to a single inevitable conclusion: unpredictability. Humanity had done something no species had ever accomplished before. They had not conquered, nor had they threatened. They had simply shown the others the truth. The strongest species in the galaxy now knew what it truly meant to fight a human, and none of them would ever be the same again.